Who wins at high noon? Welcome to the Voice of College Football. We break down the game we all love each and every day with you. Best discussion, debate, and analysis because of your participation. Please like the video. Even if you don't agree with me, if you enjoy the conversation, please like the video and subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. All right, let's get to it. We continue our TV rating series for 2022. Check out the individual conference reviews and then also the compilation and the comparison of such. Now we have been asked to do a number of other looks and angles and perspectives on TV ratings and what it means, not just laying out all the numbers, but letting you know the perspective on why certain games, certain teams, certain conferences rule college football. Let's go to high noon, keeping in mind, of course, that Fox made a decision a few years ago to say we can't win in primetime. That's owned by ABC, most notably, and also ESPN. So let's own noon, and specifically, we've got the Big 12, but more so the Big 10. Let's lock down that noon Eastern time window and make it a big deal. And they have, and let's see the results of Fox's initiative. Let's keep in mind that we've got no ratings from the SEC network and the ACC networks. That's a shame. I don't necessarily believe that the ACC would be a huge factor as much as the SEC, but of course they're showing the lesser games in those conferences, but still at times have a meaningful game that would be interesting to compare, especially since we've got numbers from the Big Ten Network. So if you can find the SEC or the ACC network ratings, please let me know. I've not been able to find them, even though I know based on what the rules in play are in releasing ratings that the ACC network is still under an umbrella, being too new, 2019, that they can withhold those ratings, while the SEC has been in place since 2014, and so those ratings should be available. Let's go to week 1 in college football and see who owned it at noon. Let's keep in mind, in week 0, Nebraska and Northwestern got together. It was one of the few games in week 0, but they had a strong rating of 4.42 million views on Fox. In week 1, interesting to note, look at this matchup. Michigan-Colorado State had the best showing at noon in week 1 with 3.9 million viewers. It was the 5th rated game of the week total. And it wasn't a good matchup. It wasn't a good game. It was lousy, and it's still Michigan, and it's ABC. And we're going to see ABC and Fox rule at noon time and time again. All right, then we see the ESPN game from NC State and ECU. And then we see Iowa and South Dakota State on FS1 show up right there, but only one top 10 game at noon with North Carolina State and East Carolina just outside the top 10. In week 2, we've got Bama, Texas. It was the number 1 game of the week. Better than any game in primetime, 3:30, any game. That was the best game and one of the most viewed games in college football the entire season. Interesting to note here, Penn State and Ohio. Again, not a good game. Got a MAC team in play. More people watched that on ABC than watched Arkansas and South Carolina play a pretty good game. 2 pretty good, prominent teams out of the SEC. We've got a Big Ten regional window. They had 4 different games, get about 1.5 million views, so a strong effort by the Big Ten network right there, but only 2 games inside the top 10 at noon. When we look at week 3, we've got a matchup that is a marquee matchup in terms of brand, Oklahoma-Nebraska on Fox. But the game was a rout at halftime. It probably would have had more viewers had it been a good game throughout, but it still barely nipped Georgia, South Carolina. That wasn't much of a game on ESPN as Georgia rolled, but also the 6th highest rated game of the week. The Oklahoma-Nebraska was the 2nd highest rated game of the week. And a lot of people say that people don't watch games at noon. I see this all the time, making excuses why their particular team or conference didn't do well in the noon Eastern time slot. We understand that's 9 o'clock in the West Coast, 10 and 11 in the Mountain and Central time zones. However, this is going to disprove all that. Even if the matchups aren't that good, people are watching college football at noon. These games regularly rank in the top 3 or 4 of the week going up against prime time. So again, we see another strong showing by Michigan against UConn. They destroyed them, wasn't a game, still had 2 million views. The Purdue-Syracuse game of note here on ESPN2, I think that really jumped up because ESPN2 does not perform well against everyone else. Case in point, the week before, Kansas State, a good team, Missouri, an SEC team, got less than 500,000 views. But Purdue, Syracuse, tremendous second half, especially fourth quarter. I think a lot of people flocked to that game. I know I did, with 1.2 million views. It was the 14th highest rated game of the week. Week 4 goes like this: Michigan, Maryland on Fox. Pretty good football game, 4.4 million views. It was the third highest rated game of the week. Clemson, Wake Forest played double overtime. So Wake Forest, with a rare big audience for them on ABC, got into the top 10 at number 7. Also Auburn, Mizzou on ESPN with over 2 million views there. As we go to week 5, we see again the Big Ten at noon on Fox. Michigan, Iowa, by far the highest rated game of the week at noon, over Kentucky Ole Miss on ESPN, which was a much better game that went right down to the wire. Still had a strong showing at 2.8 million viewers, and actually was only one slot behind Michigan, Iowa, but a big gap in terms of viewers at 1.4 million. Oklahoma, TCU. This is when TCU started to assert itself in college football, and they get a number 7 ranking for the week. Navy and Air Force got together. Do see a good following at times from Navy, Air Force, Army in some of these games for good reason. People want to see those teams that represent our country. Keep also in mind that even though Purdue, Minnesota, and Illinois, Wisconsin did not do great, there were 3 Big Ten games all on at the same time, and if you put them all together, you're looking at close to 6 million views. On to week 6, and again, this is really of note right here. So you've got Texas, Oklahoma, which I just saw a recent poll, number 2 ranked rivalry in college football by many, against Michigan and Indiana. Not a good game on Fox. More people watched, and I understand Texas bludgeoned Oklahoma 49-0. But we will see highly rated, watched games all over the place that were blowouts. Michigan and Indiana. So we know nobody's watching Indiana. It's Fox and it's Michigan. Pulling in those kind of numbers right there is the 4th highest rated game of the week. Texas, Oklahoma at number 5. Yet another big matchup, even though it wasn't a great game in the second half. It was close in the first half. Then Tennessee blew out LSU on ESPN in the second half. But you've got 3 interesting matchups that were pretty close right there between those 3 in week 6. The SEC showed up on ESPNU for one of the few times. Florida, Mizzou with less than 500,000 viewers. Interesting to note here, Purdue, Maryland, really good football game. Ended up being an important game for Purdue in winning the Big Ten Western Division as they pulled it out at the end. Only 400,000 views on the Big Ten Network. Now, the Big Ten Network, when it throws on Ohio State and Michigan, even when they're bad games against the worst teams in the conference, do much better than that number you see, Purdue and Maryland. Moving on to week 7, one of the big matchups in college football each and every season. Penn State, Michigan dominated the week. Iowa State, Texas, not really a big matchup in regards to neither team was having a big season. The Cyclones especially having a bad season at 4-8, still did relatively well because it's ABC and then ESPN. So we're seeing a pecking order in regards to conferences and then also the networks involved, as it's going to be a battle between Fox and ABC, and it looks like Fox dominating at this point, but look out for ABC late in the season here, and then ESPN a strong third. ESPN2 typically not a factor, but at 1.2 million views with Oklahoma, Kansas, that's a pretty good number for that network. It's week 8, and it's a rare appearance by the ACC at the number 1 position, not just for noon, but this was the number 1 rated game of the week in a weekend of not huge matchups, because usually there's a game that draws 8-10 million views, but this one, the number 1 rated game, it was Clemson-Syracuse. It was a really good game, important game, got almost 5 million views on ABC. Ohio State and Iowa not far behind at 4.3 million views on Fox. Interesting to note here, this was the only time all season that more people watched the ESPN2 game over the ESPN game at the same time by about 60,000 viewers. And that you could probably surmise was a Power 5 game, even though Baylor, Kansas, marginal teams last year at 6-7, over Cincinnati and SMU. On to week 9 and one of the most watched games of the college football season every year, Ohio State, Penn State. Sometimes they play in primetime. This time they played at noon. Still got 8.2 million views. It was the number 1 rated game of the week, any time slot. Notre Dame, Syracuse way behind with about a third or a fourth of the views. TCU, we start to see the TCU effect as they continue to march along at undefeated. 1.5 million views on ESPN. On to Week 10. The number one matchup at noon. Well, Ohio State was in trouble against Northwestern. That obviously drew some eyeballs at some point, but still, it's Ohio State, and it's partially ABC. And get this Ohio State-Northwestern game at noon, and we know that Northwestern was one of the worst teams. I'll say it, the worst team in the Power 5. And Ohio State did open this up in the third and fourth quarters at 21-7, so it wasn't down to the wire good. And this game outdrew all these other games, Florida, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, TCU, which was a really good game in the fourth quarter, and all these other games. And then on top of that, this game between Ohio State and Northwestern outdrew any game in the Pac-12 all season, any time zone, at 4.8 million viewers. It was the third highest rated game of the week. Week 11 looks like this. LSU Arkansas edged out Ohio State and Indiana. So once again, let's look at this. We've got two high-profile SEC teams. LSU's at this point fighting for an SEC Western Division championship. This is after they beat Bama, and they were in the driver's seat. So big game for LSU, and it was a close game down to the wire. Fifth highest rated game of the week. But barely edges out Ohio State and Indiana on Fox. And of course, the Buckeyes completely annihilated Indiana, but it still got good views. Tennessee-Mizzou, one of the few CBS games at noon. If they went at noon on CBS, it was typically the Mountain West, but here you got Tennessee and Mizzou. Strong showing from the SEC, although if you compared it against the other games on CBS in the SEC, then it was the lowest rated of the year. Notre Dame-Navy on ABC. Coming down the home stretch here at Week 12, we've got Michigan-Illinois. That game went down to the last play of the game, and you factor in Michigan and ABC, and you're going to get that kind of number. It's the second highest rated game of the week to the Ohio State-Maryland game, which followed at 3:30 on ABC as well. ABC had a big day, obviously, with Ohio State and Michigan having the two highest rated games of the week. TCU and Baylor, there again, we've got TCU coming down the home stretch and a strong showing. You normally would not see 4.35 million people watching TCU and Baylor. Nebraska-Wisconsin on ESPN, the other game at noon, over 1 million viewers, and the 10th highest rated game of the week. Week 13, you know what the deal is. It's the game, and it dwarfs everything else. 17 million people watched Ohio State-Michigan. Once again, the highest rated game of the year, as it typically is. Texas-Baylor. It's kind of amazing that people would even be watching some of these other games, although Clemson-South Carolina, obviously, two big fan bases. Close game, but they were hurt by the time slot against Ohio State-Michigan. Georgia Tech, not a good game. Still over 2 million viewers, and the 16th highest rated game of the week. We've got a couple Friday games. Of course, these factor in, and you got to understand when we've got the Friday designation there, Tulane Cincinnati played on ABC on Friday, so it got a good 1.7 million views because it had little competition. Same with Boise State taking on Utah State with a good showing on CBS on Friday. All right, that's the week-to-week showing at noon Eastern Time throughout the 22 season. Let's size it up from a number of different angles to give you a better perspective on what conferences, what networks, what teams are ruling college football in this noon time slot. We'll go to 3:30 Eastern Time. We'll go to prime time. Check out our Pac-12 video where we specifically looked at the Pac-12 on that late night TV window. Okay, let's look at the network performance first and foremost. Which network showed the number one game, the most viewed game at noon? All right, 13 weeks, 8 times on Fox, they showed the number one game. ABC showed the number one game 4 times, and ESPN 1 time had that top game with LSU and Arkansas edging out Ohio State, Indiana on Fox. Now let's look at what teams were represented in those games that were the number one rated games at noon. The Big Ten dominated. So Fox is showing the Big Ten, and they're getting the number one game of the week at noon. And the Big Ten 20 times, meaning 20 Big Ten teams in those games. Because the reason I broke it down like that is because not all of these games were conference games. So I wanted to represent how many teams showed up for the most conferences. So we got the Big Ten at 20, the SEC at 3, the ACC at 2, and the Big 12 at 2. Now let's look at the top 10 ranked games. So these are the top 10 ranked games for the entire week, regardless of time zone, but how many times a noon game got into the top 10 and was one of the highest rated games of the week. Again, it was Fox with 13 top 10 games, ABC right behind with 11, and then ESPN with 9. So while Fox dominated with the number 1 games, ABC had very strong showings through the rest of the top 10, and then you see CBS had one top 10 game at noon. That was that Tennessee-Missouri game. And then the corresponding number of viewers. If we accumulate the numbers for the entire season on each one of these individual networks, so let's also keep in mind that we see the total number of viewers, but then we've got to do some division here because ESPN2 did not have a game on 3 of those weeks. Fox or FS1 did not have a game on 5 times, and the Big Ten Network also did not have a game on at noon 1 time during the week. So there you see the total numbers. Fox ruling with over 70 million views for the entire season, ABC at 39, ESPN at 29, and those are fair comparisons because they had a game on every week at noon, and then we've got to do the division to help out the smaller networks that didn't have a game on every week at noon. Now, as we stay on the beat of the top 10 games at noon, and again, this is not the top 10 games at noon. These are games that ranked in the top 10 that day throughout all of college football, any time window that were played at noon. The Big Ten had 28 appearances in the top 10. The SEC was 17, the Big 12 with 14. Let's keep in mind that Fox pushed the Big Ten and the Big 12 at noon, certainly, and we'll look at 3:30 and primetime as well. The ACC with 5 appearances, Notre Dame with 2, and the American Conference with 1 team that placed in the top 10 at noon. Now let's look at each individual conference and how they were represented by each network during this noon Eastern Time window. Fox showed the Big Ten teams 19 times. They showed the Big 12 6 times at noon, and they had one SEC team that showed up against Big 12 team, Texas Bama. All right, ABC, a little bit more distribution here, but still the Big Ten was showing up on ABC, and you pretty much see where this Fox-ABC relationship with the Big Ten works out, where they're not going to compete against each other. So when Fox did not have a Big Ten team at noon, then the ABC, they typically did late in the year, especially Michigan, Illinois, and Ohio State, Maryland, with 2 huge showings on ABC late in the season. But again, more equal distribution with the ACC showing up with a lot of Clemson and Florida State, and the Big 12 as well at noon on ABC showing up pretty well, especially with Texas and Oklahoma. ESPN has always gone heavy with the SEC at noon. This has been going on for years and years and years. And again, they mostly show SEC teams at noon 17 times during this 22 season. The ACC shows up with a couple times, and the Big 12 as well, with 4 teams showing up at noon on ESPN. ESPN2's kind of all over the place, but at the same time, the Big 12 is a popular destination for teams at noon on ESPN2. And of course, most of those teams are playing locally at 11 in the morning. The Big Ten had quite a few showings on ESPN2 at noon as well. FS1, again, consider this kind of the relationship between ABC and ESPN. FS1 showing the discarded games from Fox, so the second and third and fourth tier teams. So it's a lot of Big 12 when the Big 10 gets the priority on Fox. So FS1 showing the Big 12 8 times, the Big 10 6 times, and the ACC 2 times. And those were individual games. That was not an ACC game. That was 2 ACC teams playing against Big 10 and Big 12 teams. And then, of course, the Big Ten Network, I think they just show the Big Ten. There we go, 24 games out of the Big Ten. And here we go with CBS. They have a contract and have for a long time with the Mountain West Conference, and we see most of those games on CBS Sportsnet. But when there's a noon opportunity, CBS went with the Mountain West. We also have the SEC. Of course, they rule CBS at 3:30 Eastern, and we'll get to that video here shortly. Okay, here we go. This really shows us something here as well. So you got to put all these factors together because they really paint a picture when you put them all together. All right, this is how many people were watching each conference at noon, and then we work out the averages as well per game because, again, the Big Ten is shown all the time on Fox at noon with 25 appearances throughout the various networks at noon, getting almost 75 million views in those 25 games. Okay, that's including the Big Ten Network. So obviously a ton of games because the Big Ten Network's factored in. We don't have the ACC and the SEC networks to go through. The SEC figures in prominently, and the Big 12. Again, it's a Fox priority to show the Big 12 at noon after the Big 10, and you got 25 million views out of the Big 12 in just 14 games. One thing that should be noted here, when we take out the Big 10 network disadvantage, so understand the Big 10 network's not going to factor into these games very often with a big audience, so it kind of hurts that average out of the Big 10. So let's take that out because 9 of those games were from the Big 10 network, and those 9 games got about 4 million views. So take those out, and without that, the Big Ten average soars, of course, without that weighting down the average. So there you have it, noon Eastern time. The Fox network has pushed the Big Ten. It's obvious. So the Big Ten has benefited, but the Big Ten is benefiting Fox because the big brands in the Big Ten, as we will see as we go through the time zones, draw big numbers at any time. There's a little less competition at noon, and Fox is taking advantage of that. It's going to be a little bit more of an interesting comparison once we go through the other time windows. Of course, the Pac-12 is no factor at noon Eastern time, no games out of the Pac-12. So now we get to the 3:30 Eastern time window. We will start to see the impact of the Pac-12 here. So interesting to note. Would love to get your comments and anything I possibly missed. I did as exhaustive a breakdown as possible. Sure, we could dissect it even more, but in terms of being brief, but also exhaustive at the same time, here you go. We will attack the 3:30 Eastern time window. Leave your requests as well right here at the Voice of College Football.